Chances are that you have seen images of Jesus that look like this in paintings, sculptures, TV shows, movies, and more. Maybe you even grew up with this image hanging in your home. But where did this image of Jesus come from? And what are the devastating consequences of it? That's what we're going to talk about today. Alexandre Dumas, a French novelist in the 19th century, made a claim in one of his writings that all modern depictions of Jesus Christ were based on Cesare Borgia, an Italian from the 15th century and son of Pope Alexander VI. When comparing features like their skin color, their hair, and their facial expression, he seems to make a pretty good argument. But researchers did a little digging and found depictions of Jesus from the 4th century and the 6th century, way before Cesare Borgia was even born. But you see the same idea: a white European man with long hair, a beard, and a serious expression. So before I reveal where this image of Jesus came from, let's touch on why images of Jesus started to appear. When Jesus was here on earth, there were no depictions of Jesus. The early Christians were faithful to the Ten Commandments, and they knew that the second commandment, "Thou shalt not make any graven image or idol," applied to Jesus especially. As a matter of fact, Luke says something in Acts that just blows my mind. Acts 17:29 in the ESV says, "Therefore, being offspring of God, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by man's skill and imagination." Wow. So when it came down to this very issue, the early Christians took it seriously, especially being around Romans and Greeks who worshipped other gods. Here's a quote from Popular Belief and the Image of the Beardless Christ by Claudine Mazel. "The early church had always been strict in forbidding the adoration of images and therefore did not want Christ's face to be memorable. But then the problem child came into power. I've talked about him before in this series. That's right, the Roman Emperor Constantine. He converted to Christianity and made Rome a monotheistic country, but so he wouldn't lose favor with the overwhelming pagan populace, he accommodated all kinds of pagan customs and traditions and Christianized them. So after Constantine's rule, you started to see artistic representations of Jesus in churches. In A History to Christianity, Paul Johnson says, "After the conversion of Constantine, all the barriers to the use of images were broken down." Here's a quote from George Fisher. "Towards the end of the 4th century, the use of images in the churches became general. People began to prostrate themselves before them, and many of the more ignorant to worship them. The defenders of this practice said that they were merely showing their reverence for the precious symbols of an absent Lord and his saints." There was resistance from people who still believed that Jesus should not be portrayed artistically, but the proponents of icons and images won, and by the turn of the 5th century, images of Jesus were found all over churches, catacombs, and even the garments of priests. So of course, with nothing to go off of, artists developed their own idea of what Jesus might look like. But remember, we're talking about Greek and Roman times. Therefore, their idea of Jesus was simply a combination of multiple pagan gods. Anna Swartwood House from University of South Carolina says, "Probably the most popular syncretic image is Christ as the Good Shepherd, a beardless, youthful figure based on pagan representations of Orpheus, Hermes, and Apollo." I mentioned the long hair in the image of Jesus. That comes from the fact that male gods in Greek and Roman circles were almost always depicted with long hair. Check this out. In Greek and Roman art loose, long hair was a mark of divinity. In letting his hair down, Christ took on an aura of divinity that set him apart from the disciples and onlookers who are represented with him. That's from The Clash of Gods by Thomas Matthews. The main difference between modern depictions and early depictions of Jesus is the presence of a beard. The Greeks and Romans did not include a beard initially, and this was because of the youthfulness of the gods they worshipped. Same book from Thomas Matthews, here's another quote. "When Christ is given a youthful beardless face, and loose long locks, it assimilates him into the company of Apollo and Dionysus. Insofar as he copied the look of Apollo or Dionysus, he assumed something of their feminine aspect as well. So then later artists wanted to capture the power and the wisdom of Jesus as the heavenly judge. So a beard was used to symbolize his wisdom and authority. But this draws undeniable similarity to Zeus, Jupiter, Neptune, and other gods. Henry Chadwick says, the representation of Christ as the Almighty Lord on his judgment throne owed something to pictures of Zeus. And then here's a quote from Robin Jensen's book. A full bearded face suggests authority, majesty, and power, and may be seen in the portraits of the senior male deities of the Roman pantheon, Jupiter and Neptune, or even the Egyptian import Serapis. The mature and bearded figure perhaps emphasizes Jesus' sovereignty over the cosmos. Here Christ takes Jupiter's place in the pagan pantheon, and the iconography makes that displacement explicit. So early Christians and modern Christians alike have the argument that the use of imagery in Christian worship is not idolatry, but is instead imagery to help the human mind focus on and imagine the true spiritual God behind that imagery. The problem with this argument is that it is the same belief that the majority of pagans have had throughout history. Most pagans believed there were real spiritual deities behind the images they worshipped. So for example, the Greeks who worshipped images of Zeus didn't believe statues of Zeus were literally Zeus. They believed Zeus was a literal deity who lived on Mount Olympus. The statue was merely an aid or representation of Zeus. So syncretism, which is the combination of various beliefs and cultures and traditions and philosophies, has affected Christianity in many ways, and it has never been a good idea to begin with. Here's an example which can prove how dangerous this syncretism is. In Season 1, Episode 2 of the sitcom Good Times, JJ, the oldest brother of the Evans family and an aspiring artist, painted a black depiction of Jesus. And we find out later in the episode that JJ's model for Black Jesus, get this, was the neighborhood wino. He didn't have anything to go off of either. His younger brother Michael found it in the closet and was immediately fascinated with it, which is not a surprise considering the amount of black pride and activism that Michael portrays in the show. So Michael decided to put it up on the wall, replacing the white painting that has probably been there since the family has lived in that apartment. So anyway, when Florida, the mom, comes in and sees the painting, she gets upset and takes it down. She and Michael go back and forth, and Michael even tried to compromise with her, asking her if both of the paintings could hang up on the wall. But before finally giving in to Michael's begging, Florida was adamant, saying things like, "The only Jesus I know is him, and this picture has been in my family for as long as I can remember." Are you starting to see where I'm going with this? She grew up with that image in her home, and so she grew up believing that that's what Jesus looked like, and got offended the first time any other depiction of Jesus challenged that. Even though the black Jesus wasn't 100% accurate in what Jesus looked like, Florida was still devoted to something that wasn't accurate either, the white image. It was her symbol of worship. Throughout this episode, she is shown looking at the white image of Jesus every time she prays. In other episodes, I think she just looked up, but in this episode, there wasn't a single prayer where she didn't look at that image. This is the hidden agenda of idolatry. We may look at the second commandment and say, oh, that's an easy commandment to follow. We don't build golden calves and statues of other gods and worship them like people in Bible times did. But let me reassure you that idols are still alive and well. When this becomes your image of Jesus, your concept of Jesus, it becomes an idol. No one on earth truly knows what Jesus looks like. But is it important? I mean, there's nothing wrong with imagining or making a guess, but don't turn your idea into an idol. Again, we see the same basic depiction everywhere. Passion of the Christ, Family Guy, where he's basically a cussing hippie. South Park, that depiction doesn't look too good either. Jesus Christ Superstar, doesn't have a full beard, but maybe that plays into the earlier depiction of Jesus. And tons of other statues, sculptures, paintings, shows, and movies. But don't let Hollywood or any artist force down your throat their idea of what Jesus looks like. Because as you can see, it has brought idol worship into our churches and into our homes. So seek Jesus daily, so that one day when he bursts through the clouds of glory to take his children home, you can have an undeniable and authentic image of what Jesus looks like. He's coming again, so make sure you're ready to go home with him when he comes.